So community-based educational spaces are part of a larger field of community-based youth work or after-school programs or out-of-school time programs. So basically it's trying to ensure that young people are getting the personal, educational, and social support they need outside of school hours. So the school day typically ends around 3 o'clock. Parents are working until the early evening. And so there's a gap in time where young people could continue to be learning, but also engage in other kinds of activities that help them build identity or help them sort of think about the world in new ways. And so the after-school community-based youth organization landscape or out-of-school time is really multifaceted and very vast. I believe that all young people, right, should have the opportunity to nurture their talents, that they should all be able to discover and play and learn and figure out who they are. For Black youth or for young people who are marginalized by race or gender, class, sexuality, I think it's really important for us to understand that schools can be and have been hostile spaces, particularly for Black youth, which I study Black education. And so the framing sometimes of community-based educational spaces as though it's always depicted as Black youth needing these kinds of programs because something is inherently wrong with them. I reject that idea. I reject that premise. The reality is that society has been hostile. We live in a racist society, and schools have been spaces of suffering and violence for young people, for Black youth in particular. So thinking about the overrepresentation of Black youth in for disciplinary action, being tracked into lower level classes instead of higher level classes like AP or advanced placement courses. And then also just sort of the ritual, sometimes humiliation, right, in schools for Black young people. And so I often see community-based educational spaces as a site of refuge from those spaces of hostility. And so while I always advocate for spaces that are not like school, and in fact, a lot of the literature in community-based educational spaces talk about how young people prefer to be in their youth program after school than they do in school. And that has a lot to do with sort of what I call a youth development sensibility. When you're in schools, it's very clear who the authority is, right? Teachers have the authority. They have the power. And it's highly hierarchical in a way that schools do. And it's also very punitive, right? You get in trouble, there may not be a second chance or a third chance to correct a mistake. And so it has been said, and it's been written, and I've written about this a lot, that community-based educational spaces can offer not just second chances, but third chances and sometimes fourth chances. So neoliberal policies in the US connected to education has really been about the idea that society functions better according to principles of the market. And along with that, you have interest around competition or individualism, meaning that every individual in society has the right to a prosperous life or a right to sort of participate in the market. But the reality is that structural inequalities exist, and that individualism is that individualism through competition is not true for everyone. It's not possible for everyone. And so there are a number of education scholars and sociologists who have done a tremendous job of documenting what happens in schools, what happens to teachers as a result of neoliberal policies. So everything from teaching to the test to measuring success or achievement solely by things like standardized test scores or grades, things that you can measure, sort of the ideas of expansion and working with more instead of quality, so quantity over quality and things like that. And even education as a whole, the school system is often treated as a business enterprise and a privatization one and not for a public good. For example, this is where you have CEOs in schools and not principals, where you have chief operating officers and not like assistant principals. What I've learned is that the same desire, right, to categorize achievement as these measurable things also happens in the after school space. So what I mean by that is organizations that are community-based organizations that might be more comprehensive, meaning that maybe they do academic support, academic development, but they also do leadership development or identity development or political education. But what I found is that funders, right, who are a piece of the puzzle in terms of funding for community-based organizations, is that they might want to see success by the increase of test scores. And so what I've learned is that organizations have been trying to sort of shift their mission or their values to align with funders whose perspectives on success is aligned with those academic, sort of more measurable outcomes. Another way that I see it really shifting the landscape is what I've called the corporatization of after school. Again, where schools are now looking like businesses and enterprises and less like schools, after school programs some of them are starting to feel more like school, right? Where the pressure to serve more students is now a measure of success. The other example that I can share is also related to the framing of Black youth in particular in community-based organizations. So a common framing of Black youth in community-based organizations or after-school programs is that, again, they need these programs because something is inherently wrong with them. And if you think about what's happened in popular media or even films or television, you see things like, well, kids are at risk, or these particular kids are at risk, or they're broken, or they're in need of saving. They need to be fixed. They come from quote unquote a broken home, right? All these kinds of things that are coded racially as well as class about who these programs are for. Again, that kind of framing says nothing about structural inequality. It doesn't say anything about systemic racism or white supremacy or capitalism or anything like that. It specifically focuses on the individual child or their family or some sort of cultural attribute. And for me, that is directly connected to sort of what I've called racialized neoliberalism, right? Where if there is failure or quote unquote underachievement, then individuals are blamed, right? Young people are blamed, parents are blamed, their communities are blamed, and not the fact that schooling in the US was not designed for Black children. This idea of wanting to sort of push back on the ways that neoliberalism sort of shapes philanthropy and how people are able to understand what they need to give and the role of philanthropy in perpetuating structural inequality, but then also trying to protect Black youth from this very toxic framing of them lacking something or them being deficient and needing to be fixed. And so this is something in my scholarship that I've written a lot about, right? The deficit isn't inherently in young people at all, no matter the young people, but especially not in Black youth. But the deficit are in systems and structures that were never designed to support and protect Black youth. Youth work professionals who are sometimes called community-based educators, sometimes coaches or mentors, they have sometimes many different names. I use the term youth worker or youth work professional because I believe it's legible, not only in the US, but also in the UK. And what's important to understand about youth workers as a group of education professionals or care professionals is that the same way that the community-based educational landscape is vast, youth workers come into the profession from all different kinds of angles, and that actually relates to the level of autonomy that they have or don't have. So for example, you mentioned social work in France being a way that youth workers sort of come into this profession. Well, there are many youth workers in the US who also come to community-based education and working with young people through social work, also through community psychology programs, or as volunteers in high school and college that they just happen to stumble upon. You have youth workers who have high school diplomas. You have youth workers who have college degrees and sometimes advanced degrees. You have youth workers whose organization might require licensing for them to even engage with young people, and they are sort of tracking their hours around and making sure that they are adhering to the standards of their organization or their profession. And then again, you have youth workers who have never had formal training on how to engage with young people. So just as the field itself is situated in a lot of different sectors, youth workers, the staff members who are in these organizations also vary. And so their level of autonomy really depends on the kinds of organizations that they're working in. My current book project focuses on Black youth workers in the US. And so I have, my research team and I have interviewed close to a little over 100 people throughout the US. And so these are youth workers who are staff members who are part-time and full-time working directly with young people, building curriculum, designing programs, community-based leaders who are running organizations or coordinating a specific program in organizations, as well as scholars, people who have been studying youth work for decades, as well as policy influencers, people who are connected to state and local government, who are working within after school or out of school time networks and bridging relationships between school districts and community-based education organizations, as well as things like city parks, recreation services in cities. So all those people have been a part of this book project, and their experiences vary. So there are some youth workers who might be highly paid, who have manageable hours, and who are fulfilled and have opportunities for growth in their positions, meaning that they can aspire to leadership positions. Maybe they are engaging with young people as a part-time staff member, maybe they're full-time, but then maybe they start directing a program, or maybe they start getting into more levels of leadership in the organization. And then there are also youth workers who are struggling with housing insecurity, right? Or struggling with food insecurity, or who are doing what's called youth patchwork, so that they are working at one organization, for a few hours, and then they're working at another organization. So they might be working from anywhere from 2 to 3 different organizations to try to make ends meet. It's also a profession where some youth workers don't have adequate health care or benefits. For youth workers who come into the profession, say from college with like college debt, being able to pay off that college debt is close to impossible. And part of that reason for some of that struggle there is related to the fact that a lot of youth organizations are in the nonprofit sector. So they're nonprofit organizations, and for those who study nonprofit organizations, nonprofits that are in care work and education, healthcare, workers are often suffering and struggling and working really long hours for very little pay, and they're essential, right, to how we live our lives. Education, healthcare, they're essential to how we function in society, but yet we don't do a good job of taking care of them. And I specifically have argued that in professions, in nonprofit professions related to care and education, there's this sense of, oh, this is good work. This is noble work. So of course you're going to do the work. We don't have to pay you because you should care about doing this, right? It feels good and rewarding to work with young people. Well, yes, it feels good and rewarding to engage with young people and witness their growth and their development. It's wonderful. And people deserve to be paid. People deserve a living wage. People deserve housing and being able to care for themselves and their families. Cities that proclaim to be progressive or liberal, right, tend to have this ethos of sort of caring for everyone in the community, everyone in the city, or connected to and interested in issues of social justice. One of my research studies was in a self-proclaimed progressive liberal city that was majority white, with growing populations of Latine, Indigenous, and Black Americans. And what was really interesting about that space is that a report came out about racial disparities in that city, where Black youth and Black community members were really at the lower tier of every indicator of social and economic and educational success. So 74% of Black children live below the poverty line. Black children had more interactions with the police, were less likely to graduate. There were all these statistics about the racial disparities. And what was interesting when this report came out is that a lot of the white residents and self-proclaimed sort of progressive liberal residents who were on the side of social justice were really shocked. Whereas Black residents in the community, they were very much like, well, we've been telling you for years, for decades, right, that inequality exists and that these disparities exist, especially within our schools. And so there was this sense of, oh, it couldn't be us because this city is consistently voted as one of the best places to raise a family, to be a kid, and it's the worst place to be Black. And so it's, how does that exist in this place that is supposed to be committed to social justice? And what I learned in talking to community-based educators, youth workers in this city is that some of those issues related to that surprise or that shock among white residents was also located in their organizations, particularly those that were led by really well-meaning white, progressive, liberal leaders of organizations with predominantly Black and Latine staff members who are youth workers directly engaging with young people. But what I learned and what I've been hearing from many of these youth workers, Black youth workers in particular, is that there is a ceiling to their leadership, right? Where they were not being promoted to positions of power, where they're very progressive, very well-meaning leaders of organizations agreed that more organizations in this city should be run by members of the community that they're serving, but again wouldn't make a path forward for many of those youth workers to assume leadership roles. Also saw it in what I call exploitation, right, where there are a number of Black youth workers who may not have an advanced degree or even a college degree, but who have spent decades working with young people, to the point that organizations that receive lots of funding, that are sort of the prized possession of the city, will will solicit the support of youth workers for their knowledge, for their expertise, and for their connection to community, their ability to know and understand the community, but won't pay them for their time or won't hire them, even though they get calls almost every other day about how to work with young people. And so I see that as exploitation. They see that as exploitation. And just a general sort of restriction to be able to work with young people in the way they deem fit, if leaders in the organization, again, who profess to be liberal and progressive, are uncomfortable. And so that even gets down to at the level of engagement with young people. So for example, many organizations are committed to engaging young people of color in conversations about race, conversations about identity. In fact, one of my most favorite jobs as a youth work professional was engaging with 9th graders and 10th graders in social identity development, right? Where we would talk about gender identity, racial identity, ethnic identity, nationality, and the ways that all those things intersected, and how they felt about themselves, how they felt about their families, how they show up in the world. All of that was really essential. And so those conversations about identity, but also about the world, right? So during the time of my studies, Mike Brown was murdered. Trayvon Martin was murdered. George Floyd was murdered. Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, I can go on and on. And in fact, in this community that I mentioned, a young man, recent graduate from high school, was also killed by the police and unarmed. And so these things were happening in the community, and young people needed a place to talk about these things and to process not only what they're experiencing in their schools, what's happening with their friends, what's happening in the city, but also what's happening nationwide. And so many of the youth workers that I've interviewed have described the ways that those kinds of conversations can get shut down in organizations that, again, claim to be progressive, but get uncomfortable with the race conversation, or get uncomfortable talking about the ways that white supremacy might show up in their organizations and also in their schools and in their, the work dynamics in the organization. And so that's very frustrating for a lot of youth workers. And what I found, again, this is very common across the US, and where a lot of youth workers feel like they're tokens, right? That they can be positioned on organizational literature, that they can be talked about in front of funders or potential funders. But again, there's no decision-making power, right? Or conversations about race get shut down. But that they're used, again, as a face of the organization, but again, not given any real power. When we think about historic Black organizations like the Black Panther Party or SNCC, there was a duty, right, to prepare young people for the way the world is, what they would be facing when they go to school, particularly integrated schools, right? And then also helping them, again, deconstruct how the world works, how institutions work, how institutions might see them. And so that's always been a part of the legacy of Black education in school and out of school. And so I see socio-political development as a part of a legacy, a very long legacy of preparing Black youth for the world as it is. And Black youth workers also see themselves as part of that tradition. And in my current book, my plan is to do that, right? Is to situate Black youth workers alongside Black freedom fighters and educators and leaders who created, independent Black institutions and Black publications, who saw it as their duty to not only allow young Black youth to learn and to grow in their education, but also to be politically aware, socially aware, and also with a very strong sense of community and pride for their communities.